Hillary Clinton has said that the US has been for too long overinvested in the Middle East and underinvested in East Asia, correct? Is that your view?
It is. I mean, my sense is that the Middle East is important for all sorts of reasons. But to fight two land wars in the greater Middle East over the last decade, and now to take on a second or a half war in Libya, and all the other crises that we have, trying to contain Iran, trying to be present in the Persian Gulf, this has really sapped America's energy. It's taken our eye off the major strategic game, which is to work with China, but to be strong enough so that when China rises militarily, it rises not into a vacuum in East Asia, but into a region where the democratic powers are very strong and are providing the bulk of security for the Asia region, and that's Australia, Japan, South Korea, and the United States. So that's the critical goal of the 21st century for America, to be able to spend enough time to focus on that rather than to be consumed by these endless land wars in the Middle East.
Now, you've said that President Obama has adopted a more realistic approach towards China today than he did when he first came to power, 2.5 years ago. And the evidence is what he's now seen the Dalai Lama in the White House, the arms sales to Taiwan. But aren't both those acts, seen from Beijing's perspective, fairly, provocative and confrontational almost?
Well, but those policies by President Obama are very much in line with his predecessors. The way to have a good relationship with China is to have a relationship that's brutally honest. So we're going to trade with China, and we'll work with the Chinese on a whole host of issues like climate change. But when we disagree with China, whether it's on human rights or religious rights or the intellectual property rights violations that the Chinese are quite guilty of, or when we don't like what the Chinese are doing in a country like Myanmar, Burma, we have to be vocal about it, and we have to stand up for the kind of values that a democratic alliance in Asia is built upon, and that's human rights. And you've seen the Obama administration be more willing to do that in the last year.
Nancy Pelosi, a longtime Democrat from San Francisco, very critical of China's human rights record. When she was House Speaker, she went to Beijing and she made the point that climate change, I can't remember the exact words, but were on par with or played a more important role in discussions with China than human rights. Do you remember those remarks, or was that?
Well, I guess I wouldn't rank order them. My sense is that you've got an agenda that's very broad, and all the issues have to be on the table. And I think human rights has to be front and center, because it's what distinguishes the Australian, American, Japanese view of the world from the Chinese government's view of the world. And if China is to play the role it seeks to play in Asia and the world at large, it needs to be accountable for the way it treats its own people.
Well, it's interesting because the Australian governments, both Labor and Coalition, tend to play down human rights issues when they deal with Beijing, but American administrations, both Republican and Democrat, tend to elevate human rights. Isn't the Australian government's position more plausible, given that there's been so much change and so much progress in China today compared to, say, 1972 when Richard Nixon went to Beijing, that more engagement has led to more progress on the human rights front? And what's the point then in trying to badger China on its human rights front?
I don't see the progress. I mean, certainly the excesses of the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s, early 70s were extraordinarily brutal and offensive to international public opinion. But the fact that a Nobel laureate is not free to travel to receive his Nobel Peace Prize, the fact that people can't practice the religion they wish, the fact that China throws people in jail because of what we would consider in Australia and the United States to be elementary civil and human rights that are enshrined in the UN Charter. This is a major problem for China in the future. The 21st century is an integrated century. It's the first time in human history when all human beings are together, find themselves together facing common threats, and for one of the leading countries of the world to assert that it can imprison its own people and do so with impunity is a mistake. And the democratic countries have a responsibility to hold China to account. So I think human rights has to be front and center on the agenda.
Now let's talk about America's grand strategy generally. The phrase leading from behind, which one key Obama advisor recently told Ryan Lizzer at The New Yorker, has generated a great debate in the United States, particularly among conservatives. What does leading from behind mean for you?
I don't understand the phrase. I think it's most unfortunate. My sense is that the United States has to lead, and lead in front of the international community, and lead from a position of great strength. And I think what President Obama has tried to do, and I very much agree with this, is to suggest that we don't always have to be in the lead. And he chose Libya as the line in the sand to challenge our European allies to take the lead. That's appropriate. We shouldn't be the world's policeman, and it shouldn't be assumed that the United States will take the lead role in every crisis. But I think the phrase doesn't adequately represent what President Obama said.
So you presumably disagreed with your predecessor in the Clinton administration as Under Secretary of State for Political Affairs, Peter Tarnoff, in May, June 1993, at the height of the Bosnian crisis. Now, these were background briefings to reporters, and then it got leaked, and he said, quote, "We simply don't have the leverage, we don't have the influence, we don't have the inclination to use military force, and we certainly don't have the money to bring to bear the kind of pressure which will produce positive results anytime soon." And he went on to say, "We're talking about new rules of engagement for the United States. There will have to be genuine power sharing and responsible sharing. But America today has a very different view of collective action than what might have been the case during the Cold War." And he went on to say, "If we will only act unilaterally under exceptional circumstances. If we perceived an imminent danger very close to home that can be defended and where the amount of resources that we expend are commensurate with what our interests are." Now, for his pains, he was immediately disowned by the Clinton administration, and he was denounced by, some might say, the foolish as an isolationist. Was Tarnoff having a downer moment and being just inadvertently honest?
Well, Peter Tarnoff was an outstanding diplomat and a good friend, and so you know, that's a long time ago. I guess I'd say this, that we're a long time past 1993, and there's a lot of water under the bridge, and the times have changed, but it doesn't, the world still requires leadership, military, political, and economic. I think the United States, I don't mean this to sound arrogant, can provide more of that and should provide more of that given our international position than any other country, particularly in the democratic sphere, in our relations with other democratic countries. But it's also true that the United States has to learn to work with others and has to work with others, take most of the great transnational problems we face, climate change and drug and crime cartels, terrorism, nuclear proliferation. The U.S. can't act alone in resolving those problems, and so we have to retain our alliances, like the ANZUS treaty with Australia, and we have to work with others, in concert with others, to resolve most of these problems. But I think from a position of leadership, and I would never want to see the United States say that somehow we should be a follower, not a leader. I don't think that's what the world expects of us.
So you're not concerned at all by any inward-looking drift among Republicans or Democrats in years to come?
As an American, you always have to be conscious of our national history and tradition, and that is that there have been times when we have followed the illusion of isolationism. And I think particularly in this century, when the world is so highly integrated, that would be a recipe for failure. I also think that isolationism is a twin recipe for failure as well. It's a road that we cannot take because, for the most part, while we may act alone, in certain instances, say when going after Osama bin Laden, we acted alone, unilaterally. It was the right thing to do. For the most part, we ought to be embedded in our alliances. That's why Australia, another reason why Australia is so important to the United States.